and welcome. For the Looking Back series, I'm Marianne Pleva. My guest today is truly extraordinary. A Westbrook resident, Ellie Chepaitis, is a world traveler, a naturalist, a Fulbright Scholar recipient, teacher, a poet, an author, a professor, a columnist, and an inventor, among other things. I am pleased that she is here with us today. Welcome, Ellie.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you for having me here.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm glad you're here. Since you mentioned you are an Italian-American, why and when did your family first come to this country?
They came in the 1890s, and that's significant because they had a bit of advantage out of, in contrast to the later waves of immigrants. They were established by the 1920s. Mm-hmm. My grandfather, Tutto, had a sand and gravel bank. My mother's family, the Nautilillos, had a water bottling, soda bottling plant in Providence, Rhode Island. And Tutto, the times were ideal because he would sell, he left a seminary, by the way, but he was very well educated because of that. He supposedly left the seminary because he wanted a family, but my father said he was asked to leave because they found him hunting with a shotgun. So I don't know. Both stories run true. So he would sell the sand and gravel, flatten the area, and then sell it and buy another place to mine sand and gravel. And his latest sale, right before he died, was to the Warwick Mall. The Warwick Mall in Warwick, Rhode Island, which is very huge, is built on Tutto's gravel bank. He used to keep my rabbits and ducks and goats and other pets there, and we would pick strawberries. He had acres of strawberries and other vegetables, even though he was running a very big business. The Governor Chafee, used to come and pick vegetables at Tutto's house, and Tutto was named Luigi Vallone, and the governor would call him Louis Guy. But he was my brother's law partner, Governor Chafee, and he was just a friend. Nobody said anything. And I think I told you once, my grandfather did everything well, but he made the worst coffee and the worst muffins I have ever had for breakfast. You'd have to love the guy to eat and drink them.
Well, it's a good thing he didn't go into the restaurant business, huh? That he was in the gravel business.
That's right. But because he came early, both sides of the family welcomed other Italian immigrants. They'd move right into their house. The night shift would go out and the day shift would come in. They'd help them get established.
Ambitious.
Yeah. And I think you were going to mention that my grandfather built a huge church for Italian Americans. He gave the rectory, he built the school, and he donated an enormous amount of land for the cemetery. He also built a seminary in Niantic, and he said it was all because he felt a little guilty about leaving holy orders, not becoming a priest.
I have to go find that one. You'll have to tell me more.
Every day he'd sit here just about this time of day, and he had a statue of the Virgin Mary, the same one that was in the church he built, and he would say the rosary. And he would call her the lady. I have to go see the lady now. And we would have to be quiet.
That's great. Well, he did well for a guy that you said came over with maybe 25 cents in his pocket, right?
Yes, that's what he said.
Yeah.
And he had no reason not to tell us.
Yeah, we do have a grandparent, a picture there.
That's my grandmother Nautilillo. She was widowed when when her husband was 50. That's my mother's mom, and she was pretty much of an empress. She ran the soda business, and she insisted that all her children were educated. They were pharmacists. They were in the business themselves, and they were nurses and teachers.
Okay. And what were the professions of your parents?
My dad was a surgeon. He was a doctor. My mother was a nurse, but he married her right in nursing school. She was only 18. So she would really take messages for the office, but she never served as a nurse because she had 5 children. pretty, not in a row, but they kept her busy. And my dad was a surgeon, but he did a lot of general practice, and he went on a lot of house calls. That's what, people didn't have transportation. They didn't have phones.
And there's your dad.
Yeah.
There's a picture. That's
that's my dad.
Going
That's
fishing
the guy who would
big
see,
fish.
he had a bullfrog in his office once. And he would see if the story was correct that bullfrogs would jump at anything red. And I can see him with a fishing rod and a piece of red flannel, seeing if the frog would go for it. One time he got a phone call. The Ruggieri's were next door neighbors, and they had what we would call it a supermarket then, but it was a little store then. And their dog had been caught. Their dog was Toby, and he was a boxer. And he was maybe he jumped up at the meat. I don't know, but he had a very bad cut. And they called him and they said, "Doc, we need your help." And he said, "Well, you can't bring Toby to the office." So he went over and he stitched the dog next door. And he was that kind of guy.
Yeah, nice next door neighbor to have.
We'd be in church in Hope Valley, Rhode Island, and the pastor would say, "You know, the oil burner went down. It's going to be a little cold." He'd go right up to the priest after and buy the oil burner for them.
Wow.
And my mother would say, "John," he didn't charge people very much. Yeah.
He was never paid in animals, though, was he?
He had a lot of people.
Paid in animals, like a goat or something for payment?
Yes.
I mean, I know that some doctors
Oh, no,
did that
that's
back then.
interesting. That's a really good question. We were paid with baskets of vegetables on the back stoop, especially cagouts, basil, but also now and then we'd find a dead raccoon, and now and then we get calls, "Come on over and cut a chunk of venison off here."
Oh.
If you dress the deer, Doc, we'll give you the hind quarter. Those were interesting times.
Yeah, I just want to show, did we show the tuna fish? So that's your dad, too.
There he is. That's my brother Jack, who became a lawyer. And that's Jack's first tuna fish. My father caught a 772-pound tuna fish once. And the tragedy of that is that they didn't know you could eat tuna. It went right for cat food or the fertilizer plant.
Wow,
this is in
that
Point
is a
Judith.
tragedy.
And you could, when you go to Point Judith near the ferry, there was a giant fertilizer plant there, and what you were smelling was the tuna being ground up, those gorgeous fish that now they're worth $30,000 each. The Japanese love them.
Your parents gave you some parental advice about careers. Would you talk about that?
Yeah, all the women in my family, not just me, and in the generation ahead, we could be nurses or teachers. That was it. And for the boys, they could be doctors or lawyers or engineers, and that was it. And I had a younger brother who was so artistic. And if he had gone to the Rhode Island School of Design, I have regrets about that. But he had to have a profession. And I think a lot of the immigrants who came over were land poor. And not just Italians. Jewish immigrants who came over were prohibited from owning land, from serving in the military, from going into certain businesses. So they tended to go into the professions also. And it was because everything was family. You had to be able to make a living, and that was what all the talk was around the table in a very nice way. How are they doing in school? My grandfather would line us up, and he had this envelope system when he paid his workers, but also for the grandchildren. And if you got all A's, and we always got all A's, we just had to, he'd give you $10 in an envelope. That was a lot of money. A lot of money back in 1950 or so. But it was not just yourself, it was for the family. And it was for the family you were going to have. They were very serious people. They had a lot of fun. But they were serious. You can tell by my father fighting the fish.
Right.
But they were very serious. And maybe it's because there was so much opportunity in this country at that time.
We have a picture of your children, if we could see your children.
Oh, no, that's my
okay,
boyfriend.
I forgot about these pictures.
That's Robert Carroll, and I'm in my uniform and about to be sent away to a Catholic camp for 6 weeks, 8 weeks. And Robert became a great hero. I had good taste at that age. He was my best friend.
Oh,
He
that's
became
great.
a fireman, and he saved people from burning buildings, burning cars. He became famous.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Let's see, what else do we have? We have your wedding,
Oh,
and
yeah,
that's the
the church
that
my grandfather built. And it was, you know, in the Roman style, as you would expect.
And let's see, we see your husband here.
That's my husband.
It was
Maybe
a-
60 pounds ago. You can see he's starting to eat right at that minute.
Right, right. Kept
And
going, huh?
He became a very good athlete. He was born in Baltimore and had what I would call a sheltered life compared to our kind of rough and tumble
wow.
life. But
Probably love getting into your family then, huh?
yeah,
Let's see, and your children, oh, your husband was a professor.
he's a professor
Yeah,
of
yeah.
history at the University of New Haven. Before that, we were in Appalachia for a while, and he worked with J. Rockefeller in West Virginia. Back then, Rockefeller wasn't a senator or anything. He was very young, and he did worked on some literacy projects. We really had to leave West Virginia, and the poverty was so terrible. This is from someone who should feel badly about it. And there was soot on everything from the coal mines, and I just thought we couldn't raise the children there. The education was
okay,
poor, and the health was poor, so we moved to New Haven.
Okay.
And to be near family too.
We have a few other family
They
pictures.
are my children.
Those are the kids.
That's Amy, Andrew, who is in charge of the patents now, and now Dan became a lawyer,
So we have
and
a
he
picture
argued.
of Dan.
The little guy went to Georgetown. There he is in Tunisia. About a half hour later, he split his head open diving off a rock. And he had went to Harvard and took 1 year off to work in Germany as a rector of a university. And then he went to Georgetown, and he argued before the Supreme Court, the Clean Air Act. And he won the case. So the Supreme Clean Air Act is legitimate. It wasn't overruled. But then he got cancer that very year, and he married that year, and he died. We went down to Johns Hopkins. He had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, the same cancer that the workers at the World Trade Center ruins got, and he worked a block from there. We went down to Johns Hopkins for a second opinion, and they said, well, you might have 5 to 15 years, and he didn't have 15 weeks.
Wow.
When you're young, it goes very fast. It's a great loss.
It's very sad. What was the first college that you attended in your...
Oh, I went to Manhattanville. It was a Catholic girls' school. I had no choice. I never saw it. I never visited it. It was the only college I applied to, and it was to make me behave myself. But I got a good education, and I majored in Russian, which 30 years later really came in handy. I was a hippie, so I thought I could do something for world peace. At that time, you had a lot of folk music. One of my teachers, Mrs. Rodjanko, was the granddaughter-in-law of a General Rodjanko from the Russian Revolution, and she taught Russian through music. So, you know, you don't forget the lyrics of songs. So I learned and kept a lot of vocabulary all my life, and I gave little concerts, as hippies did in those days.
So you didn't get in any trouble after you went to the school, right? You said you went there, you got sent there so you'd be out of trouble. Did that happen?
Not the kind of trouble. I mean, trouble in those days, it was if you smoked a cigarette.
Yeah, that's
When
right.
I went to Russia in my sophomore year, and I smuggled quite a few things in. We all did. And we all went under false pretenses. This is 1962. It was the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I supposedly was a teacher, but I was only a sophomore in college. I went with a group from Fordham, and the things we smuggled in were jazz records, holy cards, lipstick. You would think I would smuggle in a copy of the Constitution, you know. But when we were going through customs, they were taking everybody's stuff away from them. So I kicked mine under the bench. And I did get it into Russia. I stopped in Ukraine and Lviv and Kiev also on the way in. And I would be dealing out holy cards in the middle of Orthodox churches like it was going to really change the world. And so I'm doing that. And there was the youth group in Russia was called Komsomol. And they came in and they were kicking the benches over and pushing the old ladies around. So I just made myself scarce. But in Russia, the FBI interviewed me later, and they said, "Did you stay with the group?" And I said, "Of course not. You wouldn't learn anything. Nobody stayed with the group." So all of us were kind of on the edge of what you would say getting into trouble. Mm-hmm. I came home and I said, "Gee, Dad, thanks for letting me go." Toto paid for it when he heard that I was thinking of it. And Dad said, "Well, it's just one more gray hair, honey." But he didn't know the half of it.
Good thing you didn't tell him. So you also, one of your earlier jobs was a New Haven Register.
Yes, I wrote a column. The editor was Charles Kotaki the opinion page. And he said, "We'd love to have you. You have to write about women." Well, that was, you know, I was into other things like horseback riding and ice hockey and, you know, Russian studies. But I wrote about cheerleading. Cheerleading scares the hell out of me was the first sentence in that. I wrote about wife beating and how I had never, ever heard it mentioned from the pulpit. Women were told to behave themselves, but I never. We were a lot of Irish Americans in some of the parishes I was in, and drinking was often a problem. And in those days, and I never heard a priest ever, you know, talk about wife beating. The women were told, "Behave yourself," so he'll behave himself. And that might have been a generational situation. Or about things like that.
Yes. And you have at least one Fulbright.
3 Fulbrights.
3.
2 to Russia, 1 to Morocco. Because I was working in Russia, in Siberia in 90 and 91, establishing programs and information systems in Russia. So I had ties to Siberia. So my first Fulbright was to Siberia. My last was in Taganrog, right near where the fighting is now, on the Sea of Azov. And it's right near where the Russians are now taking control of the Black Sea, which they have wanted from the time of Peter the Great in 1725, because it doesn't freeze over in the winter. And the ports in the north are icebound in the winter. And so this way they have access to the Black Sea, to the Middle East, to all the shipping lanes. And so they've wanted this for hundreds of years. But when I was in Taganrog, you could walk to Ukraine. You know, they're brothers of the Russians. They're Slavs. Czechoslovakia means Western Slav. Yugoslavia means Southern Slav. The Poles are Slavs. They're like cousins. And so I would like to mention this war.
Yeah, can we have that slide too of the
house?
Ellie's house there with she's
That's
flying
my house in Westbrook.
her beautiful blue
and
and
the flag,
yellow flag for Ukraine.
Took 2 weeks to get because they're so popular. They ran out. And this war is a moral, historic, strategic, tactical tragedy. And I haven't talked to anybody that understands it, or how they're going to get out of it. These wonderful people. And I don't know how young Russians, who many of these people I taught, and now they would be 20 years later, they are 40, 50 years old. They've never lived under communism. And I just can't understand how they can control information to the extent that they don't apparently know what's going on.
Thank you. We have to take a little break for a public service announcement, but don't go away. We'll be right back.
You matter.
You matter.
You matter.
And your words matter too.
Your words matter.
What you say in the hallways at school or in the student section at a game matters.
Words can be hurtful.
Words can be offensive.
Words can leave scars.
Words can also inspire.
Support and uplift.
You and your words.
Are they both important?
As a matter of fact, yes.
Community TV, your neighborhood TV.
Publicly funded and a reliable partner for cable companies nationwide, it provides transparent coverage of local and state government, education, and public programming.
A digital town green that can be watched anywhere, anytime, and on any device.
Watch us on today's high-tech distribution methods.
Community TV in Connecticut.
Local,
unfiltered,
reliable, and yours.
9 minutes. We're back. Thanks for joining us again. I'm here with Ellie Chepaitis.
Chepaitis, yes.
Chepaitis, I'll get it before the end of the show, I'll get it right. And very happy to be. And she's talking about her very full life. And let's see. So did you mention where you taught? You taught in?
I taught at Fairfield.
Okay.
I'm a professor emeritus of information systems, and my focus is information, how to use information using computers. Like you should never, back in the 1990s, they would get computers and they'd just do the same business faster. That's not what information is for. You should do the business better, especially when I taught in Russia and Morocco. On Fulbrights, I taught quality. How do you achieve quality with this information? How do you know your customers? How do you know what to put on your packages? How do you know how to speed up delivery? How do you know how to save and pass the savings on to your customers? How do you know what to advertise? So it was very interesting because those times were interesting. But now I'm writing murder mysteries.
Okay, well, before we get to your murder mysteries, let's see. I want you to tell me about the invention, that you've made an invention that will help blind people.
Yeah. Well, I was getting an MBA, and that was my first MBA in industrial engineering, and my mother went blind at the same time from macular degeneration. And so I was trying to learn Braille, and I thought I can play the guitar, I can play instruments, I can speak a couple languages, I'll learn Braille like this. And it was really tough, and I was peaking, and I couldn't understand it. So I'm taking these courses for the MBA, and one of the classes was in ergonomics, human engineering. And that very night, we were studying airplane displays, how if a light goes out in the cockpit, a pilot can feel what the display is. And one of the principles was you have to put a symbol in a frame so they can find it. And you want to put something that you're familiar with so they can find it. And so I invented a very simple, easy to use alphabet where the letters are in frames and they're based on our alphabet. Because my mother was old, she couldn't learn Braille, and most people who lose their vision now or have partial vision are elderly. And so they're looking for the alphabet. And my students could learn it in 15 minutes. Now, Braille was invented in 1824, and mainly it was for children. They would go to school from the time they were infants. And sadly, the reason why so many children were blind in the 19th century was because of syphilis. We didn't have antibiotics that would take care of that until, I think, 1938. Churchill's father had syphilis. It was epidemic. And one of the, well, we'll get to the book, one of the reasons why children died in such great numbers in that century was because they were born with syphilis.
Wow.
And it was not just that they were sick, but they were a disgrace to the whole family. The family wanted to ship them off one way or the other.
All right, let's talk quick then about your article. Not your article.
Yeah.
Well, the articles did appear in the paper on that, your invention, but also the game that you invented.
Oh yeah, well, I found that when I taught, and the thing about information systems is computers are changing all the time. And students, when you go to med school, they say you can study something, you can learn something, or you can teach. Teaching is the best way of learning something. So my students taught the second half of all my courses. And one of the things that they would do as a project is games like Monopoly. They would invent a Monopoly game for international information systems or for international business, where you would have, you'd get a card which said, go back, you just lost your most favored nation status or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
So then this is from Sikorsky. These are workers at Sikorsky. I taught there in the year before the year 2000. And it was a wonderful game. It had pieces and a board and everything. They did a great job. And the Y2K project, by the way, which we consider at the time even a big failure, a much ado about nothing, because the elevators still worked, didn't they? It was a huge success. If we had built on that, on all the knowledge we had at that time, the Securities and Exchange Commission required every business on the stock exchange had to submit a proof of their computer system, that they were Y2K compliant. But also, in that information was every system of every big business in the United States, and we could have built a uniform security system at that time. Many of the Scandinavians had excellent security systems funded by the government, and it would have been a great legacy.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to move on to what you really want to talk about is the books. Now you have 3 books out, plus, 3 books includes the child's book, and now you have a 4th one coming out, so.
Yeah. Well, I write with, this is my first book, Murder with Kayaks. I work with the Key West Writers Guild for that, and you just do readings, and they give suggestions. I was living in the Keys and would go on these kayak trips, multi-day kayak trips. The hardest part of the kayak trips was not paddling 20 miles a day. It was getting up in the morning from a tent. And I'd crawl out of the tent, and all these young people are bopping around, and I had to find something to stand up. And I had a lawn chair, but it was awfully difficult. So they were all eating breakfast, and I'm crawling around looking for a tree. But at any rate, it was a wonderful experience. And then I wrote another Murder with Kayak book. I wrote it while I was on the island of Cayo Costa. And it's just an island with no utilities, not even fresh water. And it's a wonderful state park, but it hasn't been available because of hurricanes the last couple of years. And I wrote that in a cabin on the island.
And then you have another.
That was great fun.
A children's book.
I wrote the children's book for my granddaughter, and that is my best-selling book for some reason. And the reason is because on the 3rd page I have for the grandchildren. So when I go to book sales in Key West, all the grandparents buy that book because they can write under it to, to Sasha, to Al, and to Emily.
Clever.
And so they take it back as a souvenir. Mm-hmm. And then my last book is about children being sedated in the 19th century, and that is that hasn't come out yet. The writers group at Estuary has just been an inspiration to me. And that's because that's a real story. It's fictionalized, but it's a real history of Lyon Playfair. He was a member of the House of Commons before he went into the House of Lords. He was a knight. And he found that 3 children had died in one house. And he said, I think they were murdered. And the coroner said, we can't investigate. I mean, children are being thrown in the Thames River. We don't investigate children. And a child until the 1920s, unless they were a year old, they could not be investigated if they were murdered. Not even manslaughter, because children died so easily. And so he found that many children were being slept to death. They'd give them opium to sleep them. The parents were busy. They were in baby farms. If they were inconvenient, they'd be farmed out. And there was such a fine line between sedating a child, giving it opium for food, giving it opium when your milk ran out, or killing it. It was very difficult, but he found a way to do it with these children. And he did prove murder, but I'm not going to tell you how he did it.
Okay, I'll be waiting in line. At RJ Julia, is that where I have to go to buy one?
You could order it there, yeah, it's not out yet.
Okay, well, I'm very curious about that one. So did you enjoy writing the story based on fact more than the
That's a good question.
novels?
You know what I have trouble with? There's so much more facts because I have year after year of the testimony in the parliamentary papers by doctors, pharmacists, chemists, wet nurses, the parents. So there's so much information. I have trouble because Lyon Playfair was a Scot, and a lot of his vocabulary used, like ye ken, this, the wee band. And so it's difficult to use Victorian English that you would see on, the Victoria programs, the ones on Queen Victoria, and also to use the Scott brogue. And then as you get to the modern period, there is one chapter in 1930 to get to the kind of language we use. But that took a lot of research I didn't expect. But the book almost speaks for itself because there's so much data. And at the last Estuary Council, I did a reading from what I think will be the last chapter. And the book is getting shorter and shorter and shorter because I keep just getting rid of stuff. Because people say, you don't have to say that. Breeders aren't stupid.
Okay.
They know what an addicted child suffers from,
Yeah, well, I like short. So as I said, I'll be in
I like
line.
short books.
Yeah. So now one of your other favorite topics is the estuary in Old Saybrook.
Yes, it's a wonderful place. My husband and I almost knew nothing about it because of COVID. We lived up in Maine so our son could use the house here. And we came back and the estuary was closed last year because of COVID. And we joined in September. My husband a year ago had a stroke. And we joined really to use the wonderful gym so he could continue his therapy. And the gym is fabulous. But we go to meals there. And the food is by a chef from Johnson & Wales. It's fabulous. It's absolutely fabulous.
They have a lot of people
going. And it's a lovely, beautiful structure.
Yeah. And this is the back.
Lots of light. That's the view from the dining room. And deer walk by, and there was a heron there the other day at low tide. The herons come, and that salt marsh will never ever change. All our salt marshes are protected. And years ago, people used to think they were junk. We can't develop that land. Why invest in Westbrook? Why invest in Old Saybrook? No one can build there, and it's a blessing for all of us.
Yeah.
Or we would look like every other community south of us along the Connecticut shore, mall to mall. And we're also blessed because Old Saybrook has a very shallow harbor. And so when we moved from the steamboats, the Mark Twain kind of boats, to engines, they couldn't really use Old Saybrook as a harbor. And so it's really undeveloped, that beautiful harbor. And so the fishing hasn't been ruined, and we have more marinas here. I served as president of the Council of Beaches a couple years, and we have more marinas here. We're second only to and I'm talking about from Old Saybrook all the way through Clinton. We have more marinas here, more berths than they do except for one place in Florida. It's hard to believe.
Wow.
Well, the other thing is, why would you keep your boat in Greenwich when you could have it up here?
Yeah, close to everything.
Both for economic and also there's so much to do up here.
So I know that you love the writing group, and I know they love you.
I think
You're
so.
an inspiration to
They're
them.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Every week it's so wonderful to be read to. It's like when we were kids. Every week they write things that should be published immediately.
All right. So thank
What a
you,
group.
writing group, for sending Ellie our way. So do you have any other comments before we close? Because
No, I think that's about it. We've
Yeah.
lived through exciting times.
Yeah, we sure
as
have.
you know.
We sure have.
Whether as a woman or children of, Italian immigrants, or even as a professor, I was always the only woman in the department, and computers have been a blessing to me, even though they're a pain in the neck.
And I want you to say again how many countries you've lived in, because
I've worked in 32
worked in
countries,
32.
but a lot of that was because the Charles Dolan family gave my university $30 million. They gave the School of Business $30 million for faculty development. Well, I was ready to be developed. So I traveled almost anywhere I wanted. If I wrote papers and gave chapters and gave presentations, whether it was Japan or Belgium or Hungary. So in that way, I would work and do research there and give a presentation, and it was very worthwhile. Because then I would use that research for more research. Or when I had clients in Russia, where there was so bad, I could give my research in one word. There was no good information.
Okay.
I published for 20 years and there was no good information. And so I could take that experience, which I even was paid for, and apply for a Fulbright and do research there and publish there, and then go to Morocco and teach there. And so the research had wheels, so to speak, because it was virgin territory. And if you spoke Russian, really, there were grants and programs, and the Russians were clamoring for visitors. When we went there for the University of New Haven, I was paid. They wanted to send their children to study here, and they would pay for 4 years tuition up front, because they didn't want their kids to work to serve in the war in Afghanistan. So the Russians were getting out of town, and they wanted the skills to do it. And we were ahead in information systems in those days.
All right. Well, thank you, Ellie,
Thank you,
for spending
Mary
this
Ann.
time with us.
This has been very interesting.
This concludes our show. Remember, shows on the Looking Back series air every Monday night at 7 o'clock, and is always available on demand. So just go into Valley Shore Community TV and you'll find out how to do that. I'd like to thank our crew today: Emily Miner, Al Mankovich, Ellen Farr, and of course Chris Morgan. And a special thanks to Ellie.
Thank you, Mary Ann. I'd like to interview you someday. Had an interesting life.
Well, thank you so much for being here. So that concludes our show. Oh, and thanks for watching.
Al.